One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small. And the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today's special guest is Jason Hardy, author of many, well, actually 14 books of SOG history. So thank you for taking the time, Jason, to talk to us.
Yeah, no problem.
So first of all, a question: how did you become interested in SOG? What, or military collectibles? What got you down that path? Is there someone in your family, or?
Yeah, my grandfather had fought in World War II. He brought home a Japanese samurai sword,
Wow.
which was passed down to me. So I always had an interest in it. This is great. You can actually touch and feel history. And he was at Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
During the attack. So I always enjoyed that portion of history. So, you grew up, you watched, Midway and all those great movies. And I always read, I wasn't a big reader then, but I always talked to veterans, being a kid, just talking to veterans, going to yard sales, buying stuff, not knowing anything what it was. And it just kind of progressed from there. And then when I was in my mid 20s, I was in college and you had to read a book, and I hated to read. But somehow, some way, I wound up getting a hold of Frank Greco's book, Reflections of a Warrior.
Wow.
It was easy read, kept me interested, and at the time it was still classified. But that kind of snowballed into like, this is really great. So I started looking for other books, and then I came across Ray Harris's Break Contact, Continue Mission, and Prairie Fire, and what's Mauer's book, the Dying Place. And so I started reading more and more about it, really got interested in it. Started looking, and at the time I lived in Massachusetts, and a friend of mine had actually got a hold of a plaque, a CCN plaque, and I just, just mesmerized me. So I started collecting Special Forces, Vietnam, and then I wrote, if I recall right, I wrote the publisher of Ray Harris's book, and I wrote him to forward a letter to him, and he contacted me, and we spoke over the phone for a long time, and he gave me 2 or 3 names. You call those guys and you get 2 or 3 names, you call those guys, and it just kind of spider web from there. And this is back in the day when Ma Bell was like 5 cents a minute. I used to have, $300-$400 phone bills a month. It was, that was normal. So it's kind of how it kind of got going and snowballing. I was always good at taking notes. And then when I really got into MACV SOG, trying to figure it out as how the structures went, how it all kind of came about, because there was no book at the time that really explained all that. And again, back at this time it was still classified, so you're putting the little pieces here and there, trying to get it together. And then a friend of mine actually was at a used bookstore, and he actually, back in the day, the Special Operations Association used to print a phone book, and he wound up picking it up at a used bookstore, and he knew I collected it, so he mailed it to me. And I went through, and I remember highlighting everybody who was in the New England area codes, and then I found one was in my area code and in my exchange.
Wow.
And I was like, holy crap. So I called him. It was Joe Parner, who wrote SOG Medic and a couple other books.
Right.
And I called him. It turned out he lived maybe 2 miles from me.
Wow.
And he was real friendly. Come on over, have a beer. And we sat down, drank, and he was telling me stories and showing me photos, and and he was giving me extra photos. He's like, "This is who this is. This is who this." And I'm thinking, I'll never remember this. This is so far out of my element.
Yeah.
But I'm writing down on the back of the photo who it was, and then he's like, "Hey, why don't you come with me to the reunion in Vegas?" So I was like, "Okay, let's do that." And so I went out to Las Vegas to the Special Operations Association reunion. And actually, that year or the following year, I actually met Frank Miller,
Wow.
and so I got to meet and talk with him, and I actually hold his Medal of Honor. He had it out on the table, and he's a very humble guy, very, very nice, very humble guy. And had a good conversation with him. Um, Again, taking notes, talking to different guys, and kind of putting things together a little bit more, a little bit more. And eventually just the notes kept piling up. I mean, I've got, filing cabinets just full, of notes and copies of documents and what have you. And so decided, all right, it's time to start do a book. And kind of really didn't know which direction to go. Did my first two books. They were all right, but it wasn't really kind of what I wanted. And then I got involved with another graphic design artist, and that's when we came out with a new series and started including a lot more.
Right.
And just like I said, just kind of snowballed. I've got volume 15 at the printer right now.
Wow.
I have about 2 or 3 more to do. And everything that I know or have learned in 25, 30 years now is in a book.
Wow.
And basically the books, all they do is just basically break down the reconnaissance teams in a chronological pictorial order. Who was on the team, position they held, when they left the team, and what position they held when they left the team. If I was lucky enough to actually interview the veteran, it'd be a little paragraph on what he did post-military life. Because a lot of these guys came in, did 3 years, and got out. It's just absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing how these guys did that. And so that's always kind of intrigued me also, is how these guys, you go in the army, you serve with the absolute best you could possibly be with, and then, get out and just kind of walk away. So it's just an interesting history, I'm trying to think here. The book that's at the printer now, there's a guy named Mike Shepard, who was team leader of Montana. Really great guy, and again, it's just interesting talking to these guys. Why did you go in the military? Because he was actually older. He was 24 or so. He was older.
Wow.
And he was actually dating a girl who worked at the VA. And he walked in, and he's seen all these banged up guys, and he's like, "Look, I got to go do my part." And here he is. He went and did it. And hell, he was there for 3 years or so, 3.5 years. He had Montana for a long time. And so, again, you just try to gather their history. So his team was, again, kind of nice because you had one team leader for so long. Okay, who do you remember who came on the team? All right, when he left, who came on the team? And it kind of snowballs from there. Plus, he's one of the guys who did RT Montana did one of 11 static line airborne inserts, which is great. So there's great history there. And again, those guys did combat jump, but never received a star through their wings because at the time the U.S. Army didn't recognize small unit actions. So you had 11 static line, and then you had 5 Halo operations during the war. And probably 10 years ago, they had a ceremony at Bragg, more or less a unit thing, but still the U.S. Army, wouldn't give them a star through their wings, so who knows? but again, it's all history. So if we don't document it, it's going to go away, and how many guys have we lost who had such great history that we never got to capture? I mean, if we would have had this 30 years ago, it'd be amazing to talk to these guys, and get their history and kind of how they felt and what have you. And that's one thing about the books, when you're talking to the vets, if they've got personal letters that they wrote home, it's like, hey, I'd love to scan them and use them in the book. And some guys are like, well, and it's like, no, yeah, you got to realize people's opinions change over time.
Yeah.
But in a letter, that's how you felt at that particular time. This is what's going on in your life and how you felt about the war. So it's an amazing piece of history to actually sit there and read. So we, get their permission to actually use them in the books, which is great, again, because everybody has a different view of things today. So it's a fantastic thing to use.
So just as a sidebar, what advice, I know I'll give my advice as well, but I want to hear your input. If there is somebody who has, a veteran of any conflict, there's always a way to kind of navigate that. And for me, I've told many people, you're going to have, just kind of brace yourself, because most veterans are very curt and direct, straight to the point. So if your feelings are going to get hurt, don't even walk into a conversation. But if you can prove to a veteran that you want to know their story in any aspect, I think that's, for me, that's one thing I've never asked a veteran. So what was your worst day, or what was the bloodiest, so what are your pointers as far as the many interviews that you've done, or meetings?
Okay. I was always very good at taking notes. And these are back in the day, we didn't have this. It was phone calls.
Yeah.
So it was always interesting, you'd track down a veteran and you'd call him. And here's a guy who hasn't thought about it or talked about it for 30 years. So, I'd call up the gentleman and I say, hi, my name is Jason Hardy. I'm trying to locate John Smith, who served at Command and Control North in Vietnam. And if you have him on the phone, you can hear him take a big, yes. Well, listen, I'm an author. I'm doing research on a book. I understand that you served on recon team bop bop with so and so and so and so. And they'd be like, okay, yeah. Which kind of puts them more at ease that about them.
Yeah.
And so that would kind of put them at more at ease. So you just kind of talk to him a little bit, let him fill you out, speak with him a little bit. And then personally, I'd say, okay, listen, I'll give you a couple days and I'll give you a call back. Because you've accessed a memory bank that they haven't accessed for years, good, bad, or indifferent. But most vets, again, people use the term long in the tooth. They want their story to be known.
Yeah.
What they did, and so let me get back to it. So a couple days later, I'd call them back, speak with them, and usually they would open up and give you more information. And again, like we spoke before, you never lead a vet.
Right.
Let the veteran tell you the story, then go back with follow-up questions, to talk to him, because you don't want to interject his train of thought. Let him just tell the story. And I have probably 75 stories that the guy couldn't remember the name,
right,
or what have you, that I've written out, and you're just trying to fill in the blanks. And he can't recall the name, so you're hoping somebody else will start telling you that story, and it's like, oh, I know that story, and you go back to your notes. So, that's kind of always how I interviewed vets, and it's interesting because, not only did I do phone interviews, I would drive to their houses sometimes and speak with them. And you'd be amazed because the wife would be sitting there saying, I've never heard this before.
Yeah.
And again, I think part of it too is, especially MACV SOG, their operations were classified for so long. And if you told your wife, yeah, I was on this secret unit, we did this, that, and the other thing, first of all, the wife would be like, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe you. But when you actually, here comes a kid. At the time I was a lot younger, coming out and asking questions and talking to him, the wife would just be amazed that, no, and it's not that the veteran didn't want to tell the story. It's that the family didn't know how to ask the questions.
Yes.
Nor if you don't understand basic military, basic military, without even getting into the clandestine projects. You know what I mean? It's very hard for civilians to understand. So that's a big part of it. Type thing. So again, that's how I always interviewed vets. That's how I always talked to them. And again, the wives were and the kids were stunned. Nobody's ever talked to them. And it's being very blunt and very honest about stuff. Just let them tell the story. Good days, bad days. And I've always been amazed at no matter how bad the day was, they'll tell you about it. But and again, with that story, they'll tell you a funny story. And they'll tell you a hilarious story. It's just like, you got to be kidding me. But you know what? You ask any vet, if you go back in time, would you do it again? And they'll all tell you the same thing. You bet I would. You bet I would. So, and I probably interviewed 1,500 guys, not all SOG, but special forces, Mike Force, what have you. And I can only name on one hand of guys that I didn't care for.
Right.
Whether they were abrupt or rude or what have you. And I get it. I understand that too. Who the hell are you talking to me? I get it. You know what I mean? But again, I've done it so long that I don't hesitate to call a vet, introduce myself, talk to him, and just kind of try to get his history. And I've got back in the day, I used to audio tape a lot of guys, a little micro tape recorder type thing. And again, it's just great history, and I've just done it for so long now, I could just rattle stuff off. Oh yeah, this guy, that guy. Yeah, that guy served with this guy, that kind of stuff. So, so that's what I can tell you about interviewing guys.
So what would you advise for a younger person, or any really age person who wants to get into reading about SOG? What would be your first investment, as far as one that would give a broad understanding?
I would say John Plaster's Photo History is a very broad synopsis of what went on.
This one here, right?
That's it. That's it right there. Yes. Great book, talks about air assets, tactics. It's a good book. Some guys kind of gave him a lot of flack because his first couple books were specifically on Central, but it's like, well, that's where he was, you know. And when John started coming out with those books, CNN got involved with a big lawsuit with MACV SOG. So there was a point in time when you're talking to guys who are kind of in the group, very hesitant to talk to you because of that interview and all the crap that they did. Operation Tailwind, which was Van Busker's book. And they went down some really rat holes with it. But anyways, that's probably one of the best books, general overall view. Now personal histories, I enjoy personal histories because you get more of a feeling of what the guys were doing, what they're going through, what their mindset was. And again, North, Central, and South, well, actually go back to all the FOBs. They were so different. They were so different. A guy's war who was up in I Corps is totally different than the guy who's down in the Delta. And that's part of the problem with Vietnam. No guy's war were the same. Whereas in World War II, a Marine in the Pacific, his war was the same. In Europe, again, those guys' war was the same. Vietnam, I mean, you got this one little country,
Yeah.
and so many different demographics to it. North and Central, and basically when we boil it down, CCN, CCC, and CCS. North ran Northern Laos and the DMZ. Central ran Central Laos down to Northern Cambodia, and then South ran Cambodia pretty much all the way up. All three of them were different. So when you're talking to different guys, their wars are totally different. And that's something that's hard for people to kind of understand. Secondly, CCN and CCC, the Americans lived as a team. All the guys were in one room, one team room. Same thing with Central. South wasn't like that. South had 2-man rooms, and you bunked with another guy from another team. And South was a lot different too in their rules of engagement. They couldn't have fixed wing air assets. You couldn't use white phosphorus. There was all these stupid rules that you couldn't do. But at South, it was a lot different because a guy would be a 1-0 of a team. He would come back from a mission and be in a mess hall and meet a guy who's going out tomorrow who's a 1-0 of another team. He's like, hey, I need a radio operator. You want to come with me? And the guy would. No problem. Yeah, I'll do it. So you have a different camaraderie, if you will, at South than you do Central and North. And so it's very hard to document South teams because of that. Lindsay did a book a couple years ago.
Secret Green Beret Command in Cambodia.
Yes.
Hopefully my stack of books doesn't fall over here. But
that's it.
That one.
That's it. And if you go through there, and that's where you'll learn what I'm talking about, because you'll have a guy who served on 5 or 6 different teams when you look at his list and award orders. As a guy would get an award as a 1-0 one day, and 2 weeks later is a 1-2.
Right.
So again, South was very different than Central and North. And then they closed South in June 1970 as far as Americans running reconnaissance into Cambodia. But they had, what I understand, they had like 15 recon teams. 5 went north to CCN, 5 went to Central, and 5 stayed. The 5 that stayed became advisors and pilot recovery teams. They were not allowed to go on the ground in Cambodia unless a helicopter got shot down, because the American helicopters were still inserting the indigenous teams.
Wow.
And if a helicopter got shot down, they were authorized to go in on a bright light, if you will, to recover the pilot. Other than that, it was strictly all indigenous team members. And that was from June of 1970. I think that was a second draw. 70. Yeah. So, and again, if you look at South's history, South started with a combination of Sigma and Omega guys. When MACV SOG absorbed Sigma and Omega, together they created CCS. And so you have a really weird time frame with that too. Because you had all these guys, usually those guys were old timers, guys who were on their second, third tours type thing. And then you got a flux of new kids who came in, probably around 68, 69 time frame. So South wasn't around that long, if you really think about it, and it's very hard to nail down. It's very hard to understand and talk to guys. Usually if you talk to a guy at CCN or CCC, it's like, hey, who are the major players? Who do you remember? They'll give you the name. Yeah, I remember this guy, blah, blah, blah. South, they're like, I don't know. I hung out with this guy and that guy. That's how it was, you know. So it's difficult to try and document their history. So I'm working on a separate book on them, which is going to be basically just strictly alphabetical order. Here's the guys who were in Recon Company. I have a list of, they were reported to have served on this team, this team, this team, and this team. Because, you know, again, when you talk to a guy out of South, he'll say, well, I served on, you know, pick and wedge and awe, and they'll give you 5 or 6 teams. Well, you just can't do that. So that's how we're going to have to do that book. It's just alphabetically with the history like that, you know, and that's all we can do.
For these newer viewers, could you just explain that the different team names? I always found that really interesting, and because people are going to go, you just said RT Wedge, or like all that kind of stuff. So in the South, you had tools, and of course in the North, that you had states, and then in the middle there was like snakes, right?
No, what happened? The original MACV SOG compound was at Cam Dock, and I'm married to an Italian. That's why my hands go everywhere. You had Cam Dock. That's where your original MACV SOG recon teams were at. Your original 5. Nobody knows why, but they said, okay, we're going to name them after the 1-0's home state.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So they came out with, they had the 5 guys, they came out with their original home state names. So it was ST, Alaska, and I forgot the other, Iowa. Was it Ohio? I forgot the other ones, but
Georgia.
So they had the original 5 teams. They were named after their home state. This was late 65. The project went so well because this was a new concept that we're going to try. You know, we're going to try and do this and see how much intelligence we know, how much intelligence we can gather. So this worked out great. So MACV SOG all of a sudden got back at the White House. They're like, hey, where are we getting this information on? We want to expand this. So they said, okay. So the MACV SOG program expanded. And then they said, okay, we're going to get a flux of people in. So they created FOB1, which was at Fubai, FOB2, which was at Khartoum, FOB3, which is at Quezon, FOB4, which was Da Nang, FOB5 was just Ho Nok Tao, and FOB6 was at Bimintao. Okay, but the original ones that they created were FOB1 at Fubai and FOB2 at Khartoum. They took those states and they split them up, the teams. They split them up between the two. And then, of course, they expanded. So FOB1 and FOB2 had state names. And that's early. This is about, we're talking 1966 timeframe. FOB3 hadn't they just kind of started out with what they called the Brew Project, but they had a couple states down there too. So as the war progressed, they kept expanding on the state names. What happened was they opened FOB4 and they said, hey, we're going to do something different. You're going to name all your teams after snakes. Okay, that's what we're going to do. They opened FOB6 was CCS, which was all the old mega teams and such. And they said, you're going to name your teams after tools or inanimate objects. And they said, okay. So come around 1969, MACV SOG goes through like, hey, we got to kind of cut back on some of this. So that's when they created FOB4 became CCN. FOB2 became CCC, and FOB6 became CCS. In November of 69, they closed FOB1, Fubai. They split those teams between Central and North. That's why North has both snake and state names.
Okay.
Khartoum CCC just kept state names. And then FOB3, which was Quezon, closed out. They moved to Mylock for a short time. And then those teams got split apart and went to Central and North.
Wow.
So that's why North has both state and snake names. central strictly states, and then south is tools and inanimate objects. So that's how the names kind of came about. And for a short time, and it's very hard to document, FOB3, when they moved from the village case on to FOB3 proper, which was right outside the Marine Corps base, before the siege, they had a bunch of teams come in, and they named them after animals. There was ST Bear,
Tiger,
ST
right?
Barrett, Tiger. But again, and when you talk to those guys, by the time that kind of got going, they were all living underground because the siege started.
Okay.
So when you're trying to talk to those guys, like, hey, look, I know who was in my bunker. I don't know the guys to my right or left. Everything was a tunnel system, type thing. So it's very hard to kind of nail that down. You had Lion and a couple other ones, but you can only find 2 or 3 guys
Right.
who said, yeah, I was on this team or that team. So that's basically what I could tell you about that.
Now, one of the more interesting recon team names was a Hotcake, right? RT Hotcake.
Oh, Hotcake, yeah.
So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Hotcake came out of a guy by the name of King, who was the mess sergeant at Khartoum. And basically around 1968, you started seeing team insignia come in, where you had each of the teams start creating their own patches. And King was an old timer, and he got jealous. So he went on Bangkok. He went on an R&R flight to Bangkok or Taiwan. And he's like, I'm going to have my own patches made. So he came up with Hotcake. And he had the patch made with the spatula and the pancake with a little smiley face, kind of looked like a skull. And he came back and sewed it on his and gave it to all his indigenous personnel working in the kitchen. So that's how Hotcake came about. It's just it was a novelty type patch, type thing.
Now, if we can just spend a minute on patches, because it's very frustrating for me when I go on to eBay, and sometimes there's a diamond on there, like something really good to do with SOG history. It's very rare. But what I'm trying to get at is for a young or new collector to SOG patches. Me personally, I would say like 99% of the SOG patches on eBay are fake.
Yeah, without a doubt.
So
Yeah,
now this is where the danger lies, because with any faking of anything, they know there's money in it, and so the fakers are getting better. The actual repos are getting better and better. Is there? I don't expect you to go into super detail, but what would there be a couple of tips for people to, like, what stands out to you that instantly?
Okay. First of all, you have to understand the whole patch insignia collecting in Vietnam. When we're dealing with the MACV SOG recon teams, when you had a good mission and you came back, you got time down, you had stand down time where you could take the Americans, could take a Blackbird flight to Taiwan, and you would have 4 or 5 days in Taiwan. While they were there, that's when the patches started getting created. And you'll notice that the quality is a lot better. Okay. And other guys had some made in Thailand, and other guys had some made on Okinawa. Okay. So those are your 3 main places that we're having them made. Early, very early, we're talking 68, you'll have some local patches that were made in Khartoum. And you'll see, in my book, I point out there's several of them. There's a Vermont, and they're all kind of the same. You look at it in a little square, really screwed up hand embroidered skull, and it'd have a team name. And then as the war progressed and teams got larger, they started coming up with more creative designs, which they had made in Taiwan and, fully machine embroidered. Somehow, some way, and you got to think about this logically. A team patch would exist for usually about a year before it was changed. Whether a new team leader came in, team just disappeared, who knows? You know, and again, we'll argue with vets all day. Vets will say, well, we never had patch. You know, again, they didn't really think much about it then, you know. So a patch would only be in existence for a year. And a lot of people don't realize MACV SOG recon team, throughout the team's life, throughout the whole life from 1966 to 1972, you probably only had 25 Americans who ever served on that team. And that's a large team, you know? So you got a patch that may have existed for a year, and you would have, let's just say, 3 Americans on that team at this period of time. And you go to Taiwan. So you're going to have 25 of these things made. You're going to come back, you're going to give 3 to each American for their uniforms and 1 or 2 to the Indige. That's it. That's all there was. There isn't more than, I wouldn't say there was more than 10, what you want to call a team patch of any design that exists today.
Wow.
Okay. Because guys didn't keep them. Yeah. You brought home 3 or 4, you threw them in a box.
Yeah.
You give 1 here, 1 there. That was it. Guys didn't come home with 25, 30 of these things. You know, I came home 3, 4, 5 of them tops, you know? So that patch, how many of them actually exist today? You know, I would say less than 10 of each design would exist. Now, there was 2 guys in Vietnam. There was a Cecil Smith or Smythe, who worked for the government in Vietnam. And there was another guy named Clint Kelly, who was a merchant marine, came in and out of port all the time. Somehow, some way, these team patches made it to the local, what you want to call a commercial market. So Vietnamese started copying them.
Oh.
And it's night and day difference from the ones you get in Taiwan versus one you get from Vietnam. Okay, night and day difference when you look at them. For whatever reason, I never figured out how they got a hold of the patches, but they did. And they made what we call collector copies. But they're wartime patches, but they're collector copies. Wow. And you got to remember that generation of soldiers who were serving in Vietnam grew up during World War II, and some guys collected patches. You know, that was a big thing from World War I to World War II. So they started collecting patches. So they wound up in the patch shops, and nobody knew what it meant because it was still classified. It was just cool because it has a state or a snake and a cool name. You know, yeah, I'll take one of those, you know. So those are wartime, what you want to call collector copies. And that's what they are. Now, and like I said, you can see there's a difference in the quality of the patch. You know, you got hand embroidered, machine embroidered, and all these other things. So basically, that's kind of your. Now, even the wartime collector copies, there's only so many of them. You know, only so many of them brought back. So anyway, Cecil Smythe and I regress here. Cecil Smythe and Clem Kelly were major purchasers of these patches, and they would bring them back, and they had people who sold them because ASMIC's been around for years, which is American Society of Military Insignia Collectors. That actually started after World War I think. So they all ran ads in their local newsletters and stuff. Vietnam patches available, blah blah blah. And at the time, I think they were $2-3 a piece. You know, but again, there's only so many of them. You know, I don't think of those. I don't think there was 200-300 ever made and sold. So again, there's a limited number of them. So you got law of supply and demand. Now there's certain things you're going to look for, certain characteristics. Obviously, I'd be very careful on any eBay. No matter the story, everybody comes up with these great stories, elaborate stories. You know, I've seen them put them in frames and put them outside in the sun, and then come back. Oh, these are my father's. My father brought all these back. Just all kinds of crap stories. So you got to be very careful. I would honestly say just know who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Make sure you buy books, read the books, which will explain. I mean, I did one on MACV SOG insignia of the recon teams, and it shows in the book, it'll show here's a Taiwanese version, here's a Thailand version, here's a Japanese Okinawan version, and here's your Vietnamese version. It'll show each one of them, and that's the reality of the patches. You get a lot of different stories, but just do your research and just think about it logically. How many of these things could really exist?
Right.
And that's a big part of it. And just don't believe everything you hear or read. Just do your diligent research and kind of think about things logically. But yes, they've been repopping the insignias since the 80s.
Yeah.
It's like the SOG ID cards. They're repop. Everything's reproduced. Once anything reaches a certain monetary value, there's always a piece of crap out there who's going to start making stuff, and start dilling it out. So again, you just got to be careful of what you do. But again, this is the difference, and this is why you have more MACV SOG insignia, because again, if they ran a good mission, they got time, they got R&R.
Right.
Okay. Fifth group guys only got one R&R per year tour. Okay, you only had one. So that's why you don't see that much fifth group insignia. Personalized, personally made type insignia, where a lot of thought went into it. They didn't have time, and where you and when they went on R&R, that was the last thing they were thinking about, is having a patch made. So that's where the big difference between fifth group and MACV SOG, and that's why there's so much more MACV SOG than there is just fifth group stuff.
Wow.
So that's what I can tell you.
So, I mean, I've been collecting since I've been about not a MACV stuff, but World War II stuff, World War I stuff for a long time. In front of me and downstairs, I have a lot of military stuff, and there's things that I've had come through my hands which I've been like amazed. Things that you've had come through your shop or that you've seen at SOAR. Can you tell us a few things that were really interesting that you never thought that really piqued your interest? I mean, you have a lot of plaques behind you, though those are very interesting. They all tell a story, but is there any objects that you really thought, wow?
Yeah, I mean, she kind of reminds me. Yeah, I've had some really weird things. I was talking to a guy about it the other day. We were talking about odd stuff, and a guy sent me a package. I've been advertising to buy stuff for years, and I remember a guy. I talked to him on the phone. His name was Holbrook. He was up at CCN, but he did prior tours too. And so he sent me, his plaque and his beret and some other stuff. And I remember in there was a fishing reel, a commercial fishing reel. So I called him up and talked to him about each item and bought the items. And I'm like, the fishing reel, I said, I don't know anything. I know people collect this stuff, but I don't know anything about this. And he's like, no. He said, it was amazing 110 came up with this idea. He said, but obviously when you're doing wiretaps, you had to kind of sit there, and probe the line, and then you're sitting duck, because that meter is going to drop. The NVA are going to know that they're being monitored. They're going to send out patrols up and down the line. Well, 110 thought about it, and he's like, you know what? If we had a commercial fishing reel, we could probe, pull back up on the high ground, and when you see people coming, you just reel it in and it pull out the plug.
Wow.
And he said, we took it apart, take the out, the clicker out. But he said, He said, yeah, that was one of 6 of them we got in, so that was just kind of a cool little oddball item type thing, you know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, everything's got a story, everything's got a history. But that was one of kind of the cooler things. It's a weird thing, but yeah, it's neat, And again, you just never know what a vet has, when you talk to him, and people have been chasing them for their patches for years, and this, that, and the other thing. So you just never know what a vet's going to have, or I mean, there's a million different things you kind of think about. I got one legging from a guy, and I'm like, well, why one? Where's the other legging? And he's like, oh, yeah, I got shot in that leg, so in that foot, so they cut it off. But they kept the one. So yeah, it's just kind of neat little stuff like that. You just never know. Again, what the guy has, and I've always learned too. If you go to a vet's house, you're buying stuff from him. You always say, "Can we go in your garage? Can we go in your shed?" And they're like, "No, there's nothing military." It's like, look, let's just go out in your garage and your shed, because they get so used to seeing stuff hanging up that they don't even register it anymore. And I've walked out there and have bought bolos and field equipment that they brought home that they forgot they tacked up on the wall. So yeah, I've always said, hey, can we go in your garage or your basement or your shed out back? Because you'll always find other stuff. You'll always find other stuff.
And
But
have you ever bought any kind of firearms off the guys that maybe they took off of a NVA general or something, like a pistol?
no, you've heard them stories.
Yeah.
And one of the no, not really. One of the big things that, and I don't know where this comes from, but one of the big things people always talk about is an NVA bill that has Ho Chi Minh on it. And everybody thinks it's worth, I don't know, $1 million. And I'm just like, look, NVA money is just,
Paper.
it's all over the place. I mean, who cares? Uh, Captured stuff for the most part came back, got turned in. I do have, I remember talking to Phil Rice, RT Iowa, and they killed this guy in the golf course area. I got photos of the whole mission. I actually got photos of the guy, and it's actually kind of an interesting story. They see this guy, they're in a golf course area, which looks like a golf course. It's very flat, very open, and there's a big trail that runs through the middle of it. So they see this guy, they turn to one of their indig with the M79, and and the guy, takes the guy out. So they go over there. Turns out the guy's a messenger. He had full of stuff. So they're like, great, rucksack full of stuff. So they call in the extraction helicopters. Extraction helicopters are coming in. They said, hey, be advised, we're going to reinsert you tomorrow back in the same place. And they're like, well, they're going to know we've been here. So they said, well, bring the body out with you. It's like the body on the helicopter. And so they're flying back. Funny story. For whatever reason, they come back and they say, hey, reinsert the body. And the guys are like, well, so they strip the guy down and,
Right.
Well, unbeknownst to them, there was a cobra
Oh,
trailing them who almost got taken out by this
NVA.
So anyways, it's another story. So I get back, and the rucksack goes up. The team leader goes through it, and he gets back, and they're like, hey, you got to take that to Saigon. So he takes it to Saigon. They pulled a uniform out of it, which I have on a mannequin. And so they bring it back, and in the rucksack was a 45. And Chief SOG was like, hey, great job, Sergeant. Da, 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 da. Is there anything I could do for you? And he's like, yeah, there's a 45 in that rock. I'd like to, have that. And he's like, I'd like to get that home. And he's like, well, the mail leaves here every day, Sergeant. So he's like, okay. So boxed it up and mailed it home. And finished his tour, and he went back home, and he said he had a notice, call a local sheriff or something. And so he calls the local sheriff, and he comes out with a couple days with an army guy, and they're questioning him about this 45 he sent home, and he's like, yeah, what's the problem? And the army guy's like, this 45 was last checked out at a camp, at this camp, this date, blah, blah, blah. Where did you get this?
Oh, wow.
And he thought about it, and he goes, well, that's classified. He's like, that's classified. And he's like, well, they're him and hawing. He's like, what, keep it. I'll see you later. I'm going back to Vietnam. And he did. He took back off to Vietnam. And again, these are great stories you get from vets. There was another guy, I won't mention his name, nice guy. And he'd finished training group and went home before he went to Vietnam. And him and his buddies went down into Mexico and were partying. Then they were driving back and got pulled over by California Highway Patrol. And he pulls them all out of the car. And the vet apparently had a joint behind his ear. And, back then, you got to remember, joints are felonies.
Yeah.
So, so they pull him out of the car, and he's got this joint, and he's really giving the guy a hard time. And he's like, "Look, man, no disrespect. I just finished training group. I'm going to Vietnam, next week or what have you." And he said it was funny because the guy looked at me and said, "Well, maybe this will keep you from having to go."
Oh.
And he thought about it, and he's like, "Yeah, whatever." And his mother bailed him out, and he went to Vietnam and just didn't say anything.
Right.
So he was at Kontum, and he'd been running missions and stuff. And he said, about 6-8 months into my tour, I get pulled in to Colonel Lapp's office. Colonel Lapp was commander at the time. And, he's got a warrant basically for his arrest, because he didn't show up for court.
Okay.
So he's like, what's this all about? And he looked at it, and he's like, well, and he explained the story. And Apt was a really good commander. Apt was a World War II Marine. But anyways, he explained it to Colonel Lapp. Colonel Lapp threw it away and said, tell you what, just take care of it when you get home. So the guy finishes his tour. He goes home, turns himself in, and, they pursued it. And he was in court, and the judge said, okay, well, where's the arresting officer? And he's, well, he ran to Canada, or he went to Canada.
Really?
Because he got drafted.
Oh,
So
wow.
he went to Canada. So, again, these are great stories. You listen to these guys and tell you, and they still charge him with it, which is just a bunch of crap, but it is what it is. So,
Speaking of Canada, that's where I'm from. But the famous, RJ taking his
Graham.
bow with him. I mean, that's a story that if you read it or you saw it on a TV movie, you'd go, "Oh, come on!" But it's truthful.
I totally agree with you. Yes, it is. He did take it on a mission. He was, they were, what these guys are thinking half the time, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, he had the long bow. He took it on a mission. His thought was that he was going to, they were going to shoot a prisoner with it.
Right.
Never worked out that way. I asked him what happened to the bow, and he said, I gave it to one of the yards when I left. But great story. You know what I mean? Graham was a really good guy. I really enjoyed him. He was, his POW capture was one of the greatest ones out there, because they captured the cook.
Yeah.
And when you first hear the story, it's like, freaking cook. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah.
Well, if you really think about it, that guy knows who he's feeding.
Yeah.
What units are there, how many people he's feeding.
Yeah.
where he's coming from, where the food's coming from, how much food they have. He was a great resource. But one of the great stories, part of his stories was when they were pulling him off the trail, and frisking him down, he stepped out of his shoes, out of his sandals, showing which direction they were going.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was pretty smart about that. So, but yeah, getting prisoners was a hard thing to do. It was a lot harder than, I mean, you and I can fictionalize, yeah, we just go out there and do this. It was a lot harder to do than most people think. A matter of fact, RT Texas did one, and it was really kind of unique because one of the guys on the team, they trained and trained and trained for this because they used CS gas, tear gas, trained and trained and trained for it. And it was just kind of a fluke. But one guy, I can't think of his name right now. He was an interesting guy because he was not SF qualified. And a lot of people don't realize there was a lot of non-SF qualified guys who served in MACV SOG. But anyways, they pulled it off, and in the letter home, and it's in the book. He wrote his mother. He's so proud, but he had to really kind of word it right. We got a prisoner out of a place that not a lot of prisoners are taken and such. But again, he was a great guy. He was a draftee. He went in. He said, "Okay, I'm going to do my bit. Do my 2-year commitment." So he went in, became a medic, and he said the pay really sucked. He said I couldn't make from payday to payday. So he said, he's talking to his sergeant. And he's like, "Hey, man, I'm just not making it here. How am I going to get some more money?" So the sergeant said, "Hey, you go across the way, see those guys jumping out of planes. That's $50 a month." So he's like, $50 a month. So he walked over there and went to airborne school. And he said one of his buddies in airborne school, once they graduated, he went to Vietnam. His buddy went to Vietnam. And he said, to be honest with you, he thought, I'm going to snake out not having to go to Vietnam because, my time's coming to an end. And he said, one day I picked up a paper, and my buddy from airborne school or medic school, one of the two, was in the paper about saving these guys' lives and, doing his job. And he said, I started to feel guilty. So he said, I said, yeah, I got to go to Vietnam. And he said somehow, and he didn't remember how, he got a hold of Miss Alexander and explained, look, I'm non-SF, but I understand you can get people to Vietnam. And she said, what's your MOS? He said, medic. And she goes, well, I got an opening in SOG. Do you know what SOG is? And he's like, well, if they're in Vietnam, I'll go. So that's how he wound up in SOG, and just, again, a great guy, So yes, there were more than you would think guys who were not S qualified or special forces qualified who served in the projects in Vietnam, but usually they recruited in country, and they tried to get guys who had combat time and were airborne qualified. And Lou DeSetta tells a great story if you've ever interviewed him. He was 173rd. He was on basically going home, and he's sitting there eating ice cream. He's at the Dairy Queen in Saigon or somewhere. And, a guy comes up to him and says, so you like ice cream? And yeah, yeah, I do. And he's like, I know a unit, you can have ice cream every day if you're interested in extending your tour. And well, talk to me more, and so you had these guys hanging around, liaison officers, what you call them, and they would, kind of recruit them in. And Lou, again, good guy. He was on Nevada and Lyon, and then back to Nevada, RT Nevada. But here's a guy, 173rd guy, nice guy, and he wound up in the projects, and just a great storyteller. You talk to him. I mean, he had great combat time with the 173rd, and he said when he got on a recon team, they got off that helicopter, and you're only 8 guys, things change.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
And he said we were out. He said that first night, he said we were out, and the NVA were around, and he said you heard him, and him and his 1-0 are sitting back to back.
Okay.
And he said he could feel me.
Oh,
And his 1-0 was easy,
yeah.
easy.
Oh.
This is the way it is here. This is what it is. So yeah, you had these again. You got all these little great stories from these guys. That that you just wish the guys could just sit there and talk all day. And tell you more. And again, I wish we had this kind of technology 20 years ago.
And some of the guys that are active on Zoom, but of course not all. So we're very happy when some guys can do that, right?
Yeah.
We've done an hour. I like to try and keep to an hour. Now, if people, I would recommend that if they want to buy some of your books, they go directly to you at the dog tag, right? They can
the dog tag.
Yeah, and
yes.
I will add all that information in at the end of this interview, and links to that. And so your newest book is volume 14. It covers RT Copperhead, RT Maine, RT Minnesota, RT Phantom, RT Rhode Island. And definitely has some interesting stories in there. So that's the new one. And the other one that you're doing, the 15th one, when will that be out from the
Probably
printer?
be out
Like June, July or something?
No, it should be out at this point. April,
Okay,
May.
cool.
I don't like doing pre-orders because if there's a hiccup,
Yep.
you try to put in there, look, the book's going to be in April, May. And you take pre-orders. Well, May 1st, the guy starts emailing you, hey, I haven't got my book. And it's like, look, the book isn't in.
I've tried. Yeah.
It's hicked up to this port or that port.
Yeah.
So I wait till the end, till it comes in now to put it out there, for sale.
But that's a rough idea anyway. That will give people a rough idea. So
I'm hoping to have them all wrapped up this year. I probably got 2, probably 3 more books to get out this year. I've done a lot of it's basically just kind of cleaning up stuff,
right,
and sending it to the printer.
that's great.
Is basically it. And like I said, we're working on something on South, working on another book on the camps, and I'm working on another book on berets. So, like to try and keep the history as much as possible, type thing.
Well, how about if nearer to that date, when the 15th volume comes out, that we can have you on again, and then you can show us a little bit about it, or tell us some.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Okay. Well, Jason, thank you very much for tonight.
All right, appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Thank you.
Bye.